My first response when asked to talk about God's faithfulness in my life was to realize that God's faithfulness began before I had memory of it. So, here is my story of stories, and it begins many, many years ago. At a church gathering where all those in attendance are encouraged to share their favorite scripture verse, a little girl stands up on the seat between her parents and recites her very first memorized verse of scripture. Casting all your cares upon him, for he careth for you. 1 Peter 5:7. She is too young to remember doing this, and probably too young to understand the meaning of the recitation. But parents tell the story over and over and over. But she does remember and ponders the meaning of this for many, many years to come. A few years later, she receives a beautifully made apron as a Christmas gift from her Sunday school teacher. The teacher had made aprons for all 9 girls in the class. This, the little girl remembers. Sometime in the next few years, she receives a small New Testament from her father, who has written in it one of his favorite scripture verses, which says, "All scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness." 2 Timothy 3:16. There again, she has no memory of the day she received the New Testament. But later, as a grown woman, she wonders why her father did not continue on with the rest of the sentence, which became verse 17 and says, "So that the man of God might be fully equipped for every good work." The child grows, and at age 12, she is now a confirmed member of the church. She has a very good friend. They do everything together. But for some unknown reason, they've had a disagreement and are not speaking together to each other. The girl, this is not too good right here. They do everything together, and they know the communion is scheduled, and the friend comes to Alice and says, "Alice, I can't take communion if you and I aren't speaking with one another." Imagine a 12-year-old girl with such profound insight into the sacrament of communion. We hugged, our friendship was restored, and we knew that we were forgiven. My friend died about 10 years later from a kidney disease that would probably be corrected today. Such a friendship is long remembered. Several years later, I married a man with a strong Scottish Presbyterian background. Early in our marriage, he initiated bedtime devotions. Have you noticed that in these stories so far, and these stories that were so important to my faith and in the development of that faith, I was the recipient and not the initiator? So often, God does for us and reaches us through the actions of others. We don't tell our Creator how to do things, do we? Back to my story. Our marriage was blessed with 4 children. In 1949, our 3rd child was born and diagnosed as mongoloid. Yes, that was the term that was used then. Even though Dr. Down had described it as a syndrome in the late 1800s, it was not until 1959, after the discovery that an extra 21st chromosome was responsible for the disorder, that the terminology was corrected to Down syndrome. Before I left the hospital with Beth in 1949, our pediatrician tried to prepare me for having a child that was different. A few months later, in fact, it was about 5 months, I think, he recognized my need for another opinion, and he arranged for me to take Beth to see an endocrinologist in Philadelphia. We were living in Altoona at the time. We made the trip, saw the doctor. Not a good experience. He held Beth up under her arms and said, "Floppy baby, you better prepare to institutionalize her." From then on, and for all her life, my prayer was, "Oh God, help me to do what is right for Beth." And God's faithfulness has never failed. Beth may have been born before appropriate terminology for her disability was used, or before there was widespread recognition of abilities within her disability. But God placed in my path people who led me to a way to live out the prayer. Some of those people were my husband, with the homespun wisdom to urge me to read out loud the story of Pearl Buck's special needs child, and for me to say out loud those words that apply to our Beth. Her siblings, an elder sister and brother who taught her to swim and helped her to learn how to go to bed without mommy staying right by her side every night until she fell asleep, and a sister 22 months younger, whom we've already been introduced to as Marty, who has been her mentor and best friend, and for the last year and a half of her life, her loving caregiver, along with her good husband, Scott. There was a kind and wise pediatrician in Altoona who supported our decision to rear Beth at home, and whose checkups with Beth included asking her to count the buttons on his shirt, or to draw a picture, and then keeping those things in his medical records of Beth. There were good neighbors who welcomed Beth in all neighborhood activities. And then our minister, who worked with Beth in confirmation class and was so impressed when Beth said she would try to read her Bible. Try was the key word. There were other parents of special needs children who realized that together we could do more for our children than we could do alone. And so we formed the organization in our community of the ARC, or the Association for Retarded. It was called Retarded Children then. It's now the Association for Retarded Citizens. Together we developed programs of support, changed public attitudes, and lobbied for appropriate education. All things we could not have accomplished by ourselves. Believe me, I could go on and on mentioning people who took part in God's way of helping me to do what was best for her. Beth had the experience that I could not have imagined for her in 1949. She had many, many experiences. The school system that was started when she was ready for school was called a special education class, but it was called trainable daycare. And that's what it was called until she was age 18. Terrible terminology, but with wonderfully creative and caring teachers who helped Beth learn to read and add and subtract a little. Beth had job training through sheltered workshops and had 3 jobs in the regular workforce. She traveled to Israel, to Italy, and to Disney World. In fact, the one thing that she did that her siblings never did was that she went to Israel, to the Holy Land, and she was always proud of that. She lived in her own apartment for 11 years, with county MR supports and some guidance from Mom. Were there problems? Oh yes, some of them really difficult, but my prayer remained the same and applied equally well in all situations. I have often said that I felt so blessed that for Beth and myself, that doors of opportunity and community opened for us. And those doors didn't open by magic. They opened by people whose actions became part of my answered prayer. Our actions have a ripple effect. We are often affected by actions of those who were perhaps not standing next to us or even known to us, but we benefit from the experience. I'm going to have to get my magnifying glass. And the experience of an answered prayer or an awareness of my own actions. It has placed in me the hope that with God's guidance, I could be a door opener, that I could produce a ripple effect for others. It has brought me time and time again to the study of Scripture so that I might be fully equipped for every good deed. I have had a few glimpses that I might have had a good ripple effect on others. One of my 10-year-old Sunday school students once wrote a little play for us to perform, and he dedicated it to me. Several years later, some adults with learning disabilities who attended my church in Altoona approached me and asked if I would teach their Sunday school class because they were having difficulty with the regular curriculum that was being offered at the time. I said yes and decided to focus on a scripture verse that we could study and learn and use. So of course I chose one that was meaningful to me. Do not let any unwholesome words come out of your mouth, only that which is helpful to others and building up according to the needs of those who listen, that it may benefit them. This is from Ephesians 4:29. That verse is rich enough for weeks and even months of Sunday school teaching. When I was active in women's Presbyterian and in Presbyterian meetings, I often open with Psalm 118:24. This is the day that the Lord has made, and rejoice and be glad in it. I soon heard many others at those meetings using this verse just as I had. I know that another person's use of Scripture has had a ripple effect on me. I remember being so impressed when Pennsylvania's Governor Milton Schaap used Micah 6:8 in his 1971 inauguration. And that verse reads, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God?" When my husband, Frank, died suddenly in 1972, I used that scripture in his funeral, knowing that it perfectly summed up my husband and how he lived his life. One final story about Beth. But come to think of it, this is really a story about God. Over the years, Beth had many medical issues arise. One time, she developed a large crack in her lower lip that defied the doctor's attempt to fix. He finally suggested a specialist at Hershey Medical Center, and even the specialist treated it for 2 visits without success. He then put in one large suture. And suturing was not recommended for treating the lip, but he did use the one suture, and he wanted to use it to close the crack enough to prevent infection and to give him time to pursue other possible treatments. He asked us to return in 2 weeks. When we did, he was amazed to find the crack closed and healed. Now listen carefully. He wrote a letter to best doctor in Altoona and said, "We doctors treat the wound, but God does the healing." God does the healing. When I prayed my prayer for help to do what was right for Beth, I was perhaps without realizing, really harking back to that very first scripture that I barely understood. Casting all my cares on God, for He cares for me. It seems to be the echo that runs through all of my stories. God moves in mysterious ways, His wonders to perform. And all God's people said, Amen.